Well, this morning, friends, if you are just joining us, last week we kicked off a brand new series that we've entitled Harmony. And that's exploring issues of creation care, natural resources, and food security in Christian perspective. And last week we opened this series talking about the idea of how faithfulness is a conversation and how a monologue is idolatry. We talked about how creation began and continues as a call and response. God calls something else out and creation responds. And ultimately, God's call to us, our vocation, is to look after creation, look after one another. And I'm so excited to have our first of three guests here for this month. Here with us this morning, Chris Rinkow, who is an associate professor. He's a department head. He's the graduate chair, undergraduate chair for the Department of Religion and Culture at U of S. You have so many titles and so many degrees. That's all I'm going to crank in there right now. But Chris has a specialty in ecological ethics and peace and conflict resolution studies, which is a great combination for this topic, I think. And Chris and I met for the first time way back in the summer. Do you remember the summer? It was warm. We actually sat in your office. We opened the window just to allow a warm breeze, and the sun came up at a reasonable time. That was the summer. And when Chris and I met, something really struck me about you, is that you are both thoughtful and practical. And I love that combination. And I think that's going to be very good for us as a church here this morning. So Chris is here today to help us think about what we should be thinking about when it comes to creation care. And on top of that, how this thinking practically translates into our lives here in Saskatoon. So as we begin, can you welcome Chris here this morning? Welcome, Chris. Thanks for being here. So good. So good. One thing real quick, too. We're going to go back and forth here. We're going to have a little bit of like a live conversation interview. But if you want to get in on this, you can text in your questions. The number will be up there on the screen for the duration of the morning. Allison is up in the crow's nest with Brent. She will receive those texts. And then the best 2 or 3 questions as we have time, we're going to put Chris on the spot here and allow him to answer those questions for us. So Chris, why don't we start off like really, really practically? As disciples of Jesus, what should we be thinking about when we're thinking about creation care?
Yeah, so not an easy question to start with, I think. But
I thought it was pretty easy. Can you just knock this one out of the park for us right off the bat?
Sure. So yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. It's interesting to be able to talk to such a large group. So when I think about creation care from, well, first of all, when you call it creation care, you're already talking about something that's spiritual. When I think about spirituality, I think about connectivity and how things are connected, and I think about our relationships. So I'm trained, like you said, in Christian ecological ethics. There's only 4 of us in the world that have this particular degree that I took. And I think of that connectivity and how our relationships matter, not just on the personal level, which is very, very important, but also how that extends to the rest of creation.
Okay, so let's go a bit deeper here.
Sure.
Because when I was in your office, I had my laptop, I'm asking you questions, and you were just going. And I'm typing as hard as I can type. And then I stopped for a moment because I stopped using the word like creation care, and I used the word stewardship of creation. And you gently stopped me, you corrected me. Maybe unpack that for us a bit this morning, because that's usually a word that we use in Christian circles, right? To steward the earth, to steward our resources. Why might that not be the best term in understanding how we work in this world?
Sure. Well, I think that can be a good term, and I wouldn't, because this is such an important issue, I wouldn't push people necessarily away from that. But we've thought a lot about in my field, we've thought a lot about that term, and we've thought about the way that it actually creates a hierarchy, and perhaps a harmful hierarchy. So one of the big critiques from the outside, if you talk to sort of secular environmental activists, is they'll say Christianity really encourages this use and abuse of creation. Use of creation is very important. That's how we fulfill our needs, from financial stewardship to our nutrition needs, etc. But the thing that you have to think about is maybe what's helpful about talking about creation care is that it gets us to think about how, like I said, our relationships extend within this reality of connectivity. And it's more of a flat, less hierarchical connectivity. And then that's how you can have respect, you can have relationships, you can have sort of dialogue and mutually beneficial relationships, which I think is really important. So maybe stewardship takes away a little bit of that because it's so hierarchical.
So that means it's sort of like puts us in control of everything. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So it's an interesting tension because I'm really in favor of talking about creation as God's creation, and people who respect God then will think, oh, we also should respect the Creator and the creation that God has provided for not just us but for a whole Earth community. So one of the things that we have to think about is if that stewardship creates this intense hierarchy, so that we just think of all of creation as just objects that we can use and abuse.
So then that really plays into this idea of connectivity. That goes beyond like climate change, right?
Yeah.
There's more to it than that. I remember you saying to me when we met that there's like a sacramentality in how we treat the world. And if you care about God, you care about God's creatures. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, so in terms of like a small s sacrament, all of creation is a sacrament. We just talked about that. If it's God's creation, that you need to respect it. I've always been taught that one of the reasons that we should respect our fellow people is because the Holy Spirit is especially alive in them. To think that just stops with human people is kind of arrogant in some ways, right? And I think you need all of creation to sort of understand God. Human interaction is incredibly important, but you also need this extra element. Otherwise, God would have made everything just humans.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay, so let's put a pin in that, and I want to drive this down and get really practical for us. And I think I mentioned this to you before earlier, that this is quite a wide-ranging community. I've got lots of different kinds of friends in this church. I have some friends who are hugging trees and, using rocks as like deodorant sticks. Like, I have those kinds of friends. And I have like other friends who are really angry at me that I'm from Ontario, and they are saying that, if the pipeline could go through their living room, they would be for it. So there's a broad range of people who are part of this community. Yeah. So when we're thinking about the world sacramentally, when we're thinking about the connectivity of all things, how do those convictions practically play out for those of us who live here in Saskatoon?
Yeah, So the classic example, and I think that you were hinting at, is that there is big debates about certain ecological or environmental issues. But if you live in a reality where you understand it as being God's creation and you see everything as being connected, then these debates aren't necessarily so important, because if everything's connected, you can find sort of a place to start that feels authentic and true and best to you. And I do think that a lot of environmental activists put too much energy into the climate change issue itself, because there are these other issues that are actually very, very important. So a lot of people, I have my family's from Alberta. They're from rural Alberta, where it's the oil patch. That's where they grow up. But you can still find ways to connect with the land and the people that bring you towards this ethic of creation care.
So when we were talking about this past summer, you went even so far to say that when it comes to politics, this isn't even a left or right issue.
Oh yeah, I think this is the real major thing, is that unfortunately the way that it's divided in the US and maybe by extension into Canada is it's viewed as a left and right issue, but we all need creation. You need creation to take your next breath. So it shouldn't be a left and right issue. It should be beyond politics, I think.
So then expand my mind, because you kind of blew my mind a little bit when we met, because you said this line, and I wrote it down, so I'm going to say it exactly like you said it. I think this is what you said, at least. You said that one can be a good card-carrying creation care Christian and be a climate change denier. How is that possible? Because in my mind, it's like one or the other. How does that work? You did say that, right?
Well, I don't know if I would have said climate change denier, but yeah, maybe I did. But the basic point is there, right? Is that because there's so many entry points to this, there's so many ways that you can connect with land and people and animals, etc. That this climate change issue isn't necessarily the key piece of the puzzle, and I do think people put too many marbles in that basket. So
what is the core of the issue? If you can boil that down, if it's not climate change, then what are we actually talking about?
Well, I would challenge people, right, on this issue to think of how much of their relationship with God is just one-dimensional, looking upwards and missing what's around you. And I think that's the challenge, right? Is to think, we know this in our interpersonal relationships. The challenge is to think of how my faith in God can be expressed in the world, be expressed in my family, in my workplace, etc. When you start thinking along those lines, you have to say that those duties to God, your relationship with God, it has implications for how you relate, not just to people in your family, not just to the workplace, but how you relate to the rest of the created world. And that should be your entry point, is finding ways where you can live out your relationship with God authentically within a created world.
So then get practical with us here. Let's talk about waste for a second. Unpack that for us. I mean, the line that you used, again, I think the line you used was, are we making things better or are we making things worse? How does waste really reveal what we value? Maybe speak to a bit to our duty and our responsibility.
I mean, I think so in a prairie context, both sides of my family are from the prairies. I really admire the way that heritage of like reusing things, of being thrifty, of thinking what really matters, of having a little bit of reflection before you just go and spend. My grandma would never let us leave the table if there was like a kernel of corn left on our plate. We know that like intuitively that you shouldn't waste. It's part of the prairie ethic. When you look at it, ethics that wastes food, it's also an ethics that wastes people, it's also an ethics that wastes the rest of creation. And I think you really have to be attentive to those things. So that can start on that very personal level of not taking more than you need. But that extends in so many different practical ways. And I just encourage people to sort of find their own path in all of that.
So then back us up even further then, because you mentioned what the dinner table was like when your grandma was there. But let's talk a bit about settler culture and the indigenous connections here. And maybe part of our mythical past, right? Like everything was so perfect and like amazing back then, but where we came from really has defined where we are here. So help us understand how we fit in to the bigger story, like here on the prairies. Yeah.
So I think there's two things, and I don't want to lose either of them. So I think in sort of Western culture, we have our own sort of mythical past, and we tend to idealize the past. We think of it as a place, all the way back in the past in the garden, that was a place of paradise. But I think people, in the way that we think about the garden, we also think about maybe the early 20th century in that way. So you have to be, in this work, I think it's really important to recognize that there are things that the past is a resource for us, that we all have a heritage, no matter where our culture is from, where there's something that we can sort of recover from our heritage that's important for today. But that doesn't mean leaving behind like medical technology. There's lots that's also good from today, and it's finding that new combination so that we can live faithfully in the world that is the challenge. That obviously, to me, and I think to you from what I understand, that obviously also relates to Indigenous settler relations. I think that part of the story of what happened on the prairies is that sometimes there was this knowledge that would have been beneficial if there had been a dialogue between people and between cultures that was lost because the horizon just wasn't there. Christians were complicit in that. Especially in my tradition, in Catholic traditions, there was a sort of a violent evangelical imperative to make people Catholics, to make sure that they would sort of conform. People with what they thought were good motivations imposed not only Catholicism on people, but also a very narrow understanding of what that would be. And I think we lost something. We're starting to realize that we lost something in that interchange, and that the people that are from this place should have something to also teach settlers, and that dialogue is absolutely crucial and important. And that's respect for the natural world, that's respect for diversity in the natural world, but that's also respect for diversity amongst people, and that not everyone has to be the same, and that we can find ways to care for creation, maybe even with different motivations.
I love that. That's good. So maybe from there, take us a bit into your head. I mean, you spend time thinking about this, teaching about this. When you think about where we are today, what worries you about humanity's approach to creation care? Like, what's on your mind? What troubles you?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I have 3 kids. I think Christians have a special calling in this. So if when I went through University of Manitoba, I went to school, I went in environmental studies, and I went to school with people who were, strong advocates for one of the ways to have a sustainable world would be to, severely reduce human population. I don't think that that's sort of on the cards for Christians because of the way that we respect human dignity. So I think our challenge as Christians, and I think it's a worrisome challenge, but also an exciting challenge, is to find ways to live in proper relationships with God, our neighbor, and the rest of creation when there's 8 billion human persons on the planet. So that's worrisome, but also exciting. And I think that the creativity and our calling can come together, and Christians have something very important to contribute to this. And a lot of environmental activists, I guess the default assumption until very recently, although this is shifting, was that Christians didn't have anything to contribute. That, the one mention I had in environmental science going through at University of Manitoba of religion was to Genesis, and this idea that God gave us creation, and that's why Western cultures abuse nature.
What do you mean by that?
That God's gift of creation has been interpreted that it's just a license to use and abuse creation. That's the one reference we had to religion in our whole program. And I know that there's other possibilities, and I think that most of the people here would know that there's other possibilities.
When we talked about this summer, you'd even said that, what's on your mind is how there is one creation like us who has the ability to affect the whole world. Like, we're the only ones who can do that. Can you speak to that a bit?
So humans are very special in a lot of ways. One of the ways to understand how we carry the image of God is that we do have, power of reflective thought. We have the power, or the ability is maybe a better word, to disobey God's will. And maybe something like a tree doesn't have that power in the same way. A good tree normally does what it's supposed to do, right? I'm not too familiar with too many sinful trees. So this is, like all of these things, and maybe related to what we were just talking about, this is an opportunity for us. What do we do with our powers of reflection, our powers of abstraction, etc.? How do we use those gifts in a way that helps complement creation, that helps even participate, from a Christian perspective, participate in the new creation, participate in the perfection of creation, rather than taking those abilities and using them in a way that harms our relationships with God, with our neighbor, or with the rest of creation.
I think that's a great point. I want to move it to a more of a hopeful place. But like you said, a tree is going to be a tree. A tree knows what it's supposed to do, and it's going to do it. It's like we're the only ones who we want to be what we're not, right?
Yeah.
So then, what brings you hope when you see the larger picture?
Yeah.
What part does the church play, the local church play, in creation care?
So this is something that actually is incredibly compelling to me, is that there's people who are inspired by faith. In our case, we're talking about people who are inspired by Christian faith, who are doing this work of participating in God's good world. And that to me is incredibly hopeful. And that to me is an energy that's transformative, that's necessary. And I have students who are mostly moved by Christian traditions and live simply, live in good relationships, struggling to find different ways of being in the world that isn't just this abusive way towards other people and towards creation. So I see the hope in those people. Okay. Yeah.
How does that look in your own home? And I know we didn't ask talk about this, but you're teaching this all day, you're thinking about it, and you have 3 kids. I've got kids, many of you have kids, and sometimes our convictions and the luxury we've gotten used to, the demands that are in our world, sometimes those are hard to connect. So practically, what does that look like for you in your home?
Okay, yeah, so we never talked about this, but
sorry.
Yeah. No, we haven't talked about a couple of things, and that's totally fine.
That's just the way it rolls up here.
Yeah. So I teach this stuff, and I try to integrate like different things into my life. I have a sort of mentorship relationship with my kids, and I try to show them that there's other possibilities. Many of them which are really good for their health, right? So I have my oldest boy, if we're getting very personal, is on the spectrum, and I find that time outside is incredibly good for him. It calms him down. If he's just inside, he gets where he can't. It's a strange combination of where he can't focus, and he's also all over the place, literally, right? So time spent outside, time spent connecting with nature. Although we technically qualify for busing to the school where they go, we're right on the block. So we're on the opposite side of the street where we would qualify for busing. We never took the busing, and we walk the kids to school. Just teach that culture. The challenge for me as a prairie person that did spend some time I did a master's in England. I skipped a winter, and then the temptation is to stay inside when it's like this, right? But embracing the cold, realizing that there's something special there. I make sure that they go play, hockey outside on the community rink. Things that were important to me growing up that I thought of as just natural things that are maybe this generation is missing out on. So sort of mentoring the kids into possibilities that make them stronger physically, make them more focused. And I think that a lot of that is just connecting with creation and being outside.
So like, do your kids like ever push back and say, but Dad, so-and-so drives them, but Dad, this happens at so-and-so's house, like then what?
Well, I notice it's their friends who react against that, right? So we had a 10-year-old stay over at our house for a sleepover, and I said, oh yeah, now we're gonna walk to the park. He's like, he was pushing back. He's like, why don't you love us? Aren't you gonna drive us to the park? And I just don't know where we got to that space in our culture where the default assumption is always one that takes more resources, is meant to save us time but doesn't save us time. So thinking through those choices is really important. We eat meat, but we don't eat meat at every meal. Just basic things like that. We're very careful to. Even though it makes a small difference, I think about the sort of virtue ethics of doing composting and getting the kids involved and taking the compost out and things like that. So yeah, just teaching those basic things. And I think all of those are entry points. They're not going to develop a sort of integral spirituality of creation care, but if they have those habits, and then later on, those are entry points where you can talk about what are the spiritual reasons for doing these things, which we talk about a little bit. But I think you can develop that in a full way later on if people have the habits and you're thinking of ways of developing sort of those positive habits that benefit us and creation at the same time. It's really interesting how there's that mutual benefit that's going on there. Yeah.
One last question, again, not rehearsed, so let's see what happens,
Yeah.
and then we'll move to some Q&A. So for those who are in the Lakeview Church community, what would you say to those who are on one end of the spectrum, who are the tree-hugging type, and what would you say to those who are on the other end, saying, put the pipeline through my living room? How would you encourage us? How would you lead us forward? What are the things that we should be thinking about? Because again, at the end of the day, we're a church community, right? We're on the same page. Diversity is okay. But at the same point in time, there's a certain responsibility we have as Christians, even in disagreement. So help us move forward on both those spectrums.
Well, I think there's lots of ways. If you ask me this, I probably would answer it differently, depending on which day. But I really like that. One of the things that my attention is drawn to, that your last question made me think of too, is if you can come up with a project that maybe people come at with different motivations. And it could be something very simple that could also be beneficial for the community, right? So something like a riverbank cleanup. You could get people behind that. There's different reasons to do that, because they love Saskatoon, because they love creation, because they're concerned about like the toxins that might be released if a tire is left on the riverbank, things like that. If you can get together for a common project and then maybe after you've done that riverbank cleanup, you sit down for a meal and you talk about your different motivations and why you're there, and look for common ground and respect where there isn't common ground. I think that's a good way within sort of any community. So one of the things that I work on the sort of bigger picture is we have this group called Communities Inspired for Environmental Action, big long name, and it's representatives of different faith communities in Saskatoon and Indigenous people who identify with Indigenous spiritual traditions, sometimes exclusively, sometimes in combination with another mainstream tradition, which is why that name is so odd. And we agree every year to do 2 or 3 things together with completely different motivations, completely different backgrounds, and on all those levels, on race, class, religion, and we can find 2 or 3 things to do a year, and maybe you do things maybe with those groups. So the tree huggers can get together and do something once in a while. The other end of the spectrum can get together and do something once in a while. But finding ways to come together, I think that's important for the community as well.
It's thoughtful. Thank you. We're going to transition really quickly here. I'm assuming some of you have texted in some really thoughtful questions. I see Allison and Brent working in a fury there. We're going to take a moment. We're going to take some questions from the floor. Any last thoughts for everyone before we roll into whatever the question is coming?
No, I just appreciate the chance to be here and think through some of these things with you, and thank you for your patience. It's just wonderful to see the energy in your community, and I know I don't bring that same sort of dynamics, but these are important issues, and if you can bring, maybe that's what you need too, is someone who has these ethics and also has those skills to have the dialogue in the way that you do. Yeah.
Totally. Well, Thanks for saying that. Trust me, they're super bored of me. You're great. They like you. That I can tell. But I love the fact that someone like you is in a place of like higher learning. You're in a place where you are influencing people, and that you've spent the time to thoughtfully research, engage, and track with this. This is a gift for our community, and it's been a gift for us this morning here for our church. So as that first question comes up, can we thank Chris already for the good things that he's offered this morning? Thank you, Chris. Thank you. All right, we're going to see what this first question says. I hope it's a good one. The question is, how do you incorporate or include the natural world into your spiritual practice and worship practices? It's a great question.
So this is a whole area of study. It's called eco-liturgics. It's very exciting.
Write that down. That is good. What is eco-liturgics?
So it's the idea of bringing. So liturgy is the worship. So bringing, and there's also eco-spirituality, so bringing those 2 areas into your personal practice and your communal practice, and thinking through ways that, I think you modeled it very well actually this morning, that there's resources that are traditional resources that actually connect to these things. The wonder and awe of God in creation is a real good entry point, and then thinking of ways that you can creatively bring the seasons even into your worship without joking about the prairie cold, sure. That's actually something that's good and special and is important for the way that biodiversity is expressed on the prairies. If it was always warm, we'd have a very different situation, for instance. So, so what can you do for eco-liturgics? So you can do those things. Think about seasonal celebrations. A lot of the things that we do already. So Christmas is very interesting, right? So we talked about how we're noticing how it's dark, but the light is coming into the world today, right? Christmas is at a time that's very close to the solstice in the northern hemisphere. Thinking through those connections. Thinking through harvest is also a very important thing on the prairies, and having, I don't know if you do, but having worship that's connected to harvest is an important thing. One of the things you could do that's very popular in England right now is having a service to bless animals. So you have the service.
Really?
Yeah. So you have the service of dedication and baptism that you're offering slots for, or maybe you can have slots for people to bring in animals that they're close to, and not just domestic animals. Maybe some of you have a farm and you can get interesting animals together and see if they enter into conflict or not. It's an exciting service.
I'm sure it would be an exciting service. Yes, that's fascinating to me. But the reason behind it is what?
Is to realize that there's elements of your worshiping community that are sort of kept to the side, right? if you just accept the point that for a lot of people, the relationship with their animals are crucial relationships. So you have the capacity where you have sort of a separate service for children, right? But you probably also do things like baptism where you bring the children into the community. And that's one way to think about it is if you always kept the children aside, are you saying something about the limits of your community? So even if you take it from the point of view that you have someone who's part of your worshiping community, who has a deep connection with animals, maybe bringing in those animals on that one day is a way for them to acknowledge that relationship and bring it to the community for that one day. Right. And some of them are, we joke about it, but some of them are very interesting services. You could do basic things like going down to the river and getting some stones and having a service where literally as a touchstone to help remember some of the ideas that you've talked about in the service, people will take a rock that's been down by the river, take it home with them and have just like a physical reminder of the lessons that you gave for that day.
So again, it'd be about just how everything is connected. Right?
And ways that excite that imagination.
Totally.
So we talk a lot about in ethics, in Christian ethics, we talk about the moral imagination and how part of what preaching and liturgy and your spirituality to do is to excite that moral imagination, to get you to think through the consequences of your relationships of being a faithful person. That also extends to creation. So there's resources to do this. Cool. Yeah.
That's great. Do you have any pet llamas that we can borrow?
Yeah. Well, does someone have a llama that's here?
Does someone have a llama? There's got to be someone.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next question.
Sure.
Let's see what's up here. The question is this. There is a doom-gloom narrative on both sides of environmentalists and some Christians. He's saying, oh yeah. What theological perspective keeps you from both of these?
I actually think so we just talked about the moral imagination. I think that I'll talk about the positive side too, but I think that there is something about like that good old-fashioned like revival preaching to get you worried about the end times and changing your ways that's active here, and it's actually important. So we talk about the apocalyptic imagination in ethics, to thinking about getting you to sort of change your ways, and Christians get this. And maybe this is something that is important to think about if we continue on certain paths, how it's going to be harder to be a good, faithful Christian in the world. So I think that that's actually an important thing. My inclination is not to focus on that exclusively, like you say. I think there's a lot of hope in the idea that creation is also a promise. It's a promise that God has made to us, and that there's paths that we can see, and maybe we can see in dialogue with maybe environmental science, other areas that can help us participate in the new creation. And I think that participatory element of the new creation is something exciting and hopeful and energizing for Christians.
So last piece on that then. Like, does it bother you? Is it okay to have these extremes? Is it okay to be wrestling on like both sides? Because sometimes I feel like there is no middle ground. And you said earlier in one of your responses that perhaps doing things together is a step in like the right direction. But then how do you honestly deal with, the doom and gloom part when we really know that God is bringing creation to something good?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the question. Is God just going to sort of sweep down and make everything good and fix everything? And there are some Christians that think that. There's Christians that advocate for using up resources as quick as you can, as polluting as much as you can, because that'll make the second coming of Jesus come quicker. So I'm hesitant to go that's one
not
view.
Us, by the way. That's
no,
not
I know,
us.
but that's one view that I'd say that's probably a dead end.
Yeah.
I try to be inviting, but that's yeah. But so that's the extreme to me. That's the extreme. It's not the extreme. Isn't someone who votes conservative, votes liberal, or votes NDP. That's not the extreme. So thinking of ways. So if you accept that there's not going to be this sort of like complete divine rescue mission, that's not what the new creation is about. How can you, or even in the meantime, if that is part of your theology, even in the meantime, how can you create the conditions, support the conditions, participate in the conditions that help people live faithfully in the world? That is where I think a lot of people can agree. Even if you have a different view of the end times, you can agree that in the meantime there is a value in giving spaces and structures for people to live faithfully in the world.
So if we were to summarize it, we could say we would be joining God in the renewal of all things. That's what you would say, right?
Or responding to a calling for that, yeah.
Fair enough.
If that seems arrogant to you to join with God, yeah.
It's good.
I'm a little bit hesitant to speak for God, but
Some of us make a living out of it.
Yeah,
Got to be
yeah.
honest with you. But Chris,
but you get the idea, right? That there'd be a space where you could participate in God's good work. I think it's maybe a good way to talk about it.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Chris, I want to say just how thankful I am for you. I love your demeanor, and when we met this past summer, I knew you'd be an amazing fit. So thank you for sharing with us. Thanks for the good work you're doing. Can we thank Chris for sharing with us this morning? Thank you. Well done.